Good evening, everyone. Today we're starting with something very close to our own reality. Sleep, or more precisely, how people slept in the Middle Ages. Long before our modern obsession with ergonomic pillows, memory foam, and sleep tracking apps, medieval sleep involved straw, fleas, animals, and sometimes sleeping half upright so as not to be mistaken for a corpse, which ends up being far stranger than most people imagine. But before we begin, I want to thank you for always being here and for the positive messages I've been receiving. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like to be notified whenever new videos are published, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the volume on your TV or phone to something comfortable. Relax, enjoy the video, and let's talk together about a time when our hours belonged to saints, not handed over for free to an algorithm. Before electricity, before sleep influencers, and before doom-scrolling the apocalypse, medieval people approached the night with a routine that would completely confuse any modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part cycle split cleanly down the middle like a hard medieval biscuit. The routine was simple. After sunset, most people went to bed early, falling into what was known as the first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they would deliberately wake up and spend the next 1 to 2 hours doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia, it was just how sleep worked. The waking period between the two sleeps was seen as practical, useful, and sometimes unsettlingly social. People used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend the fire, or check on the livestock, because nothing ruins your sleep rhythm quite like wondering whether your goat is still in the yard. And yes, this was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Medieval doctors and marriage manuals noted that the body was well rested and the mind calm during this period, which sounds like a polite way of saying too tired to argue. So if you think it's romantic to wake up early and make coffee for your partner, know that your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep came after this interval and lasted until dawn. From monks to peasants, everyone followed this nightly rhythm. Even writers like Chaucer mentioned it casually, which means that yes, even medieval literature already complained about people not sleeping properly. Interestingly, modern science suggests that segmented sleep may actually be more natural for humans, since the two-sleep cycle aligns better with our circadian rhythms in the absence of artificial light. So the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m. listening to stories to fall asleep, don't panic. Just whisper to yourself, "Oh right, the vigil has begun." And remember, you could be checking on goats. It was only in the industrial era, with factories, gas lamps, and a growing fear of unproductivity, that humans began forcing sleep into a single, uninterrupted block, as if sleeping were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure, it was the schedule, and everyone followed it, willingly or not. Now let's talk about beds, or rather the medieval version of them. Today, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress feels like sleeping on a cloud. In medieval Europe, however, a bed was often just a pile of things that used to be alive, now flattened by the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. A typical peasant's bed consisted of a straw mattress known as an enchersau. It was literally straw or hay stuffed into a rough fabric sack, if they were lucky enough to have a sack. Otherwise, it was just straw on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already occupied by a cat. These straw mattresses weren't comfortable,
but they were better than nothing, which was the alternative. Straw was cheap, abundant, and provided decent insulation against the cold. It was also excellent at housing insects, lice, and occasionally a field mouse, turning sleep into an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If something bit you, you shifted slightly and hoped for the best. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functioning spine, they might raise the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. This didn't dramatically improve sleep quality, but it did slightly reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear. Sheets were a rare luxury. Most people slept in the same clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and personal space even less so. Entire families slept together, children, parents, sometimes a grandparent, all in the same room, sometimes on the same pile of straw. The nobility, of course, slept differently. They had real beds, large wooden structures, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and curtains to block drafts, and with luck, lice. These beds were so valuable they were often listed in wills. You didn't inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's oddly lumpy feather bed. Even so, for most medieval people, the bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place to avoid freezing, dodge chickens, and maybe dream that one day you'd be rich enough to sleep on something that didn't squeak or rustle. When we hear the word nightcap today, we think of a cozy final drink, maybe tea, whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable life choice. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink, it was a hat. A real, physical, often surprisingly stylish piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing while you slept. Medieval buildings weren't exactly known for insulation. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment did little to keep the cold out. And central heating was called the family dog. So to keep their heads warm, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble sleeping cap. These caps came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep to wear. They were usually made of wool, linen, or whatever scrap was available that wouldn't irritate the family goat. For men, the cap was purely practical. For women, it often doubled as a coif, helping maintain modesty and cover hair that hadn't seen soap since the last Lent. But beyond warmth, nightcaps also carried social meaning. In some regions, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, yes, even while sleeping. And caps could be embroidered or dyed to reflect family wealth or status. After all, nothing says success quite like going to bed with a tiny flag on your head. In larger towns, the sleeping cap even became a symbol of being off-duty. Answering the door while wearing one was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I'm not dressed to talk." And yes, the hat meant, "Please go away."
Of course, nightcaps were usually paired with sleeping shirts, basically long, loose tunics. Think less luxury sleepwear and more Scrooge without the moral lesson. Sleep clothes weren't meant to be attractive. They were practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is usually limited to red-eye flights, overly optimistic camping trips, or that one bizarre hostel experience. In medieval Europe, however, it was completely normal and not optional. Imagine you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Paris. You find an inn, already a luxury, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, not a bed, not even a particularly clean floor. You get a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns functioned more like communal dormitories than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. If there was space in the bed, you shared it. usually with total strangers who might snore, talk in their sleep, or display a suspicious number of boils. This wasn't rude, it was efficient use of resources. Beds could hold 2, 3, sometimes even 4 travelers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a great hall lined with beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring competitions had no judges. Elbow territory was fiercely contested. Sometimes men and women were separated, sometimes not. Some inns tried assigning beds by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But more often than not, the rule was simple. Whoever arrived first, sprawled first. And while this sounds like a nightmare to modern germ-conscious minds, at the time it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with wolves, rain, and the occasional peasant revolt. Because of theft, many travelers slept with their money pouch tied to their belt or hidden beneath their clothes. Others slept directly on top of their belongings, turning their luggage into both a pillow and an alarm system. If someone messed with your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The wealthy, of course, avoided this fate. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort, or demanded private rooms, assuming the innkeeper valued his roof and continued existence. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and falling asleep. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. That's why prayers before bed were so popular. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval people wound down with confessions, psalms, and spiritual insurance clauses just in case they died between good night and sunrise. The logic was simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, demons, or, more dangerously, from being over 30 in the 11th century. So you said your prayers not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying and you didn't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually misaligned. A common prayer went something like, "If I die before I wake, I ask the Lord to take my soul." Cute, right? Except it's essentially a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. Many adults kept an entire catalog of prayers, one for guilt, one for suspected demons in the ceiling beams, one for plague prevention, which unfortunately did not age well. Some even prayed to specific saints believed to protect sleepers, like sacred bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The deeply devout, monks, nuns, and excessively anxious nobles ended the day with Compline, the final prayer service before sleep. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which wasn't difficult since everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, partly for their souls, partly because it gave them something to do besides asking why the dog was in the bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds sweet until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system. In short, bedtime prayer was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it as a medieval antivirus. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how.
In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as nonsense, random brain noise, stress, too much cheese, or your mind filing paperwork in the dark. In the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously. Seriously as in eternal consequences. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were believed to be messages from God, saints, the devil, guardian angels, or possibly that strange relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations. Others were demonic temptations. Either way, you were expected to pay attention and possibly write them down, confess them, or fast for 3 days just to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were devoted to decoding them. Dreamed of fire? Could be hell. Dreamed of water? Could mean purification or drowning. Dreamed of a goat-headed man juggling fish? Call a priest immediately, and maybe consider moving. They believed that whatever happened in dreams mattered because your soul remained active while you slept. That meant your actions in dreams could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That slightly embarrassing dream about stealing bread? It might be your subconscious confessing gluttony, or you might just have been hungry. Still, better confess it anyway, just in case. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for receiving holy visions in their sleep. Others were discreetly advised to eat less onion before bed. Dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles, they were also excellent storytelling devices. Medieval literature is filled with dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures delivering poetic lectures about virtue. Dreams were basically medieval Netflix, more allegory, fewer happy endings. The church, predictably, was suspicious. Not every dream was divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamed something improper, it might mean your soul was under attack, or that you slept too close to the fireplace smoke again. These distinctions were not always clear. Nowadays, people sometimes let their pets sleep in the bed. It's cozy, if occasionally smelly. In the Middle Ages, however, sleeping with animals wasn't an eccentric personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's be practical. Medieval houses weren't built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating was called the family pig. In peasant homes, it wasn't uncommon for humans and animals to sleep in the same room, sometimes in the same bed, and very often on the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely. Dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snored softly near the hearth. With luck, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people did care for their animals. It was about survival. Animals produced body heat. They were warm, reliable, and, unlike certain relatives, didn't steal the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing. A cow in the corner could raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in January felt like a miracle. Most peasant houses consisted of a single room used for cooking, eating, sleeping, and occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, shared the same space. Children might sleep nestled between parents and a goat. A chicken could serve as an improvised alarm clock. Hygiene? Best not to ask too many questions. For most families, cleanliness was more of a seasonal suggestion than a routine. Nobles generally didn't sleep next to livestock, though they might keep lapdogs in bed, not for warmth, but for fashion and flea redistribution. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favored animals, because nothing says medieval elite like a dog with its own room and title. Of course, there were downsides. Animals make noise, they move around, and historically speaking, they're not known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. A hoof to the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the sleep routine.
And if you've ever shared a room in a hostel and thought, this is too much, allow me to introduce you to the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort was a distant rumor. Monasteries did not believe in personal space, softness, or, frankly, fun. A typical dormitory housed dozens of monks sleeping together in one large hall, usually arranged in neat rows like morally upright sardines. The beds, if they can be called that, were often wooden boards, sometimes topped with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous. On feast days, you slept fully clothed. Not for modesty, but because changing in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than simply going to bed ready. The monastic uniform, tunic, belt, sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and extremely poor insulation. If you were cold, you added layers. If you were hot, well, no, you weren't hot.
There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested, by the rule of Saint Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might end up cleaning chamber pots for a week. Snoring, however, existed in a gray area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the abbot might hold you accountable, or at least your fellow monks would. Lighting was minimal, maybe a candle. You didn't need to see, you just needed to stay still and avoid sin. That was the goal. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey, denying the flesh any excess. Sleep wasn't pleasure, it was a monitored, scheduled necessity, like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting upright just to avoid any hint of luxury, dreams, or healthy circulation. And compared to that, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig wasn't divine, and it didn't judge you. Now, let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers: waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m., not to use the bathroom or scroll for dopamine, but to pray, loudly, in the cold, by candlelight. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first prayer of the day. And by day, they meant the darkest part of the night, when even owls were still deciding whether waking up was worth it. The bell rang, usually rung by whoever drew the shortest straw, and an entire dormitory of sleep-deprived, spiritually ambitious souls dragged themselves to the chapel in silence, still fully dressed, because monks did not wear pajamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, under flickering candlelight and echoing stone vaults, they chanted psalms, recited scripture, and did their absolute best to not fall asleep standing up, which, incidentally, was a real and recorded problem. There are records of monks being punished for dozing off during matins, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You fell asleep during matins? Congratulations, you're leading the next one. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to keep your spirit engaged while your stomach remembers that dinner was lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. After the service, monks either returned to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter orders, went straight to study or manual labor, because nothing says sacred discipline like threshing wheat on 4 fragmented hours of rest. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the quietest, darkest hours of the night to God, free from the temptations of daylight, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion, or at least it felt that way once you got past the numb feet, candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting.
In the modern world, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or simply the ability to control your own blanket. In the medieval world, however, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or outright dangerous. Let's start with the obvious reason: warmth. As we've seen, beds weren't exactly cozy. Stone walls, open chimneys, and total lack of insulation did nothing to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. So people shared beds for body heat, not intimacy, but pure thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, except no one asked if you wanted to participate. But warmth wasn't the only concern. There was also a spiritual reason for group sleeping. Many people believed that night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul was thought to be more vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral protection zone. If something went wrong, at least there would be witnesses, or someone to wrestle the demon first. For children, sleeping alone was almost unthinkable.
not just because of fear, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were considered part of the nighttime landscape. Stories warned against solitary sleep as an invitation to mischief and spiritual danger. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these usually didn't end in hugs, they ended in disappearances. Even married couples often shared their beds with older children or temporary guests. Privacy wasn't really a concept, it was more of a modern myth. In fact, the idea of just two people sleeping alone in a large bed would have seemed wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious settings, even monks typically slept communally. And if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often a punishment. Yes, in some cases, sleeping alone was literally disciplinary action. Medieval logic was simple. Sleeping alone created opportunity for sin. Sleeping in groups created accountability. So, the next time you curl up in your own bed with your own blanket in a room that doesn't smell like goat, take a moment to appreciate the silence. In the Middle Ages, you'd probably have 2 children, a shepherd dog, and a cousin right next to you, all snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up, in class, on a bus, or in a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a stiff neck and deep regret. In the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle choice. Some medieval people, especially the wealthy or the deeply devout, preferred to sleep reclined rather than fully lying down. Why? Several reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was medical belief. Doctors thought lying flat was bad for digestion, lungs, or the balance of bodily humors. In a world where sneezing could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. Sleeping upright was believed to prevent congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but basically meant don't drown in your own mucus. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying completely flat was considered the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract the attention of the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstition? Absolutely. But when the local priest was also your healthcare advisor, you chose your battles carefully. As a result, many people slept semi-reclined, supported by large bolsters, cushions, or wooden headrests, the medieval equivalent of a recliner. Nobles sometimes had beds designed with angled supports to keep them sitting upright, perfect for digesting a heavy meat pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. Monks, however, took things further. In stricter orders, they sometimes slept sitting on benches or leaning against cold stone walls with nothing but a hood to soften the discomfort. This wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. And if you sinned, congratulations, confession starts at 5 a.m. In short, sleep quality was not the goal. Virtue was. Discomfort was a feature, not a bug.
Forget haunted dreams or monsters hiding under the bed. For medieval people, the real nighttime monsters were already in the sheets, small, persistent, and completely uninterested in your prayers. We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom, the bedbug. Let's be blunt. Hygiene was not medieval Europe's strong suit. Bathing was rare, washing clothes was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances best left unnamed. Combine that with straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken wandering near your feet, and you have the perfect environment for an all-you-can-eat parasite buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically roommates. Peasants dealt with them daily. Nobles weren't exempt either, despite satin sheets and feather mattresses. In fact, some wealthy households employed dedicated delousers, real servants whose job was to remove lice from their employer's hair and clothing. Imagine listing that on your resume, master of the noble scalp. Bedbugs, however, were the true silent assassins of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feast like tiny vampires.
If you've ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always because of the cold. Sometimes it was armor, defensive clothing against insects. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively unhinged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel pests. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may not have stopped the bugs, but certainly killed the romance. And the discomfort wasn't just physical. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of humanity's fallen state and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some oddly romantic. After all, why say united forever when you can say united by the flea that bites us both? So while modern sleep is disrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was far more likely interrupted by itching, twitching, and that subtle realization that something was crawling up your shin. And the worst part? It probably was.
Everyone has had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently sleeping ready for a duel builds character. To be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in chainmail is a bit like attempting to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But in times of war or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armed was considered the safer option. When comfort was optional and survival highly recommended, a soldier on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping the chainmail and breastplate on, just in case enemies decided to throw a surprise party at midnight. Nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to fight while still dreaming about turnips. In Northern Europe, especially among the Vikings we mentioned in another episode, warrior men sometimes slept with swords or axes beside them, a kind of aggressively sharp security blanket. Shields became pillows, and if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you didn't need to get dressed. Priorities. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron doesn't breathe. Chainmail has a nasty habit of pinching skin. Add stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient soundtrack of snoring companions and crackling torches. Congratulations, you've built a sleep environment that scores about a 2 out of 10. Even those not actively at war sometimes slept in lighter protection in dangerous regions. Merchants, travelers, or night guards might doze in gambesons, thick, padded jackets that offered some protection and slightly more comfort than prayer alone. And let's not forget, armor is not subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, it clanked loudly enough to wake everyone and convince them the apocalypse had arrived again. In a world where demons at night and parasites in your bed were genuine concerns, you might think sleepwalking would be just another inconvenience. It wasn't. It was terrifying. In the Middle Ages, if you got up and wandered around while asleep, people didn't blame stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, cursed, or had unresolved business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and widely feared. The sight of someone rising from a straw mattress, dragging their feet across the room and staring blankly at a wall wasn't a harmless parasomnia, it was a dress rehearsal for the devil. Accounts from the period suggest people were genuinely afraid of sleepwalkers. Picture it, a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, glassy-eyed, muttering Latin he doesn't even speak, stepping over livestock. Would you think medical condition or ghost? Depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by imbalanced humors, especially too much black bile, the medieval wild-card explanation for anything mysterious. Others thought it happened because the soul temporarily left the body during sleep, leaving the body free to wander around like an unguided mule. To prevent nocturnal adventures, people tried everything: herbal remedies, prayers over the bed, iron amulets, and in more rural areas, simply tying the person's leg to a chair. Extreme? Maybe, but remember, medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically knocked over. There were even rumors of people climbing onto rooftops while asleep. True or exaggerated, these stories led to barred windows and serious theological debates about whether someone could sin while unconscious. Fortunately, most sleepwalkers just wandered, muttered, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleptwalked into a church, villagers might treat it as a divine sign or perform a purification ritual just to cover all spiritual angles. And if medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos.
Church bells, storms, screaming animals, the occasional siege. For medieval people, this wasn't disruption, it was background noise, the medieval version of white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day: sunrise, prayer hours, meals, and of course the merciless hour of matins, somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams probably came with a steady soundtrack of ringing metal. At some point, the brain simply adapted. The bells became a lullaby for an overscheduled soul. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. Without weather apps or triple-paned windows, every thunderclap felt like the end of the world. Roofs leaked, windows rattled, chimneys howled like banshees. And yet, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop because you slept badly. Fields still needed plowing. Prayers still needed saying. And occasionally, someone still needed to run from Vikings. Invasions and apocalyptic events didn't always interrupt bedtime. In the 14th century, people somehow kept sleeping through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled through town in the morning, they were seen less as a reason for panic and more as a grim alarm clock. And if you didn't wake up at all, some believed that was mercy. There are records of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and angry crowds. Chronic sleep deprivation reshaped bodies and expectations. If you worked from sunrise to sunset, ate poorly, and spent your days dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you collapsed hard at night. Some even used sleep as an escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or the fear that the world was literally ending, a prediction that surfaced roughly once per century, some people simply wrapped themselves in a cloak, muttered a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. The Middle Ages gave us cathedrals and sacred manuscripts, but they also left behind court records, confessions, and letters, and those documents reveal a far less holy side of medieval convents, a side that includes secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, escape tunnels, and even full-scale orgies carried out under the disguise of spiritual ecstasy. When a woman entered a medieval convent, she was expected to leave the world behind, along with her dresses, jewelry, and surname. She also surrendered any right to physical affection. In theory, she became the bride of Christ. In practice, that marriage was often open to interpretation. The vow of chastity was serious business. No touching, no flirting, and definitely no midnight meetings in the cloister garden with Brother Thomas from down the hill. But as any good historian or exhausted bishop will tell you, vows are only as binding as the will to keep them. And in many convents, that will was flexible. For some nuns, chastity was treated more like a suggestion. After all, if you're locked behind stone walls for decades, surrounded only by other women, and the occasional suspiciously handsome confessor, things can get complicated. Some were creative. It was whispered that affection didn't count if it wasn't intentional. Others leaned on spiritual loopholes. If Christ was your heavenly spouse, who could object to a little mystical passion, especially if you wrote about it in Latin? Ecclesiastical inspection reports often included delicately phrased complaints such as excessive familiarity between sisters or unaccompanied male visitors in the orchard. Translation: someone was misbehaving, and it was probably near the apple trees. Some convents functioned more like noble boarding schools. Wealthy families sent away their problematic daughters with the clear expectation that someone else would deal with their enthusiasm. Some tried,
Others shrugged and hoped the bishop wouldn't visit too often. To be fair, not every nun strayed. Many lived genuinely devout lives, praying, studying, and baking bread capable of denting a helmet. But others, let's say, interpreted chastity the way modern people interpret all-you-can-eat. So yes, chastity was written in ink, sworn before God, and embroidered into rulebooks. But behind those quiet walls, it was occasionally rewritten.
Pregnancy, as a rule, is hard to explain, especially when you're a nun. You can hide a secret lover. You can smuggle forbidden cheese. But a growing belly is significantly harder to tuck under a habit, and even harder to explain without involving at least one other person, several sins, and occasionally a very confused donkey. Medieval convents were meant to be sanctuaries of chastity. Reality had other plans. Church records, bishop complaints, and scandalized abbesses suggest a recurring truth: nuns were getting pregnant. Not hypothetically, not symbolically, physically, undeniably, inconveniently pregnant. The excuses were often creative. Some claimed demonic possession. Others cited miraculous conception, which, while technically precedented in Scripture, was met with skepticism when it happened 3 towns over and involved Brother Jacques, the leather steward. One nun even claimed she had fallen onto a man. Hard to argue with gravity. Once discovered, convents usually reacted with panic and strategic amnesia. The pregnant nun was sent on retreat or suddenly developed a prolonged illness requiring complete seclusion. If she gave birth, the baby might be quietly taken away at night to a foundling wheel, to a sympathetic relative, or, in darker cases, to nowhere at all. Some infants were discreetly buried on convent grounds, marked with stones that sounded like vague apologies to God. The next question was always the same: who was the father? Answers varied: priests, traveling nobles, gardeners. In one memorable trial, the accused was an itinerant musician with a harp and an indecent smile. No further explanation was given, or needed. Punishment was inconsistent. Peasant-born nuns might be expelled in disgrace. Noble-born sisters often received stern warnings and a sabbatical. One particularly bold abbess was caught with both a lover and a child and still managed to keep her position. Management clearly worked differently back then. Officially, the church insisted these were isolated incidents, rare, tragic, deeply regrettable. And yet, the documentary trail says otherwise. Parchment doesn't lie, especially when it's soaked in scandal. If medieval convents underestimated one thing, it was the power of paperwork. Love behind cloister walls was a delicate operation, quiet, coded, and written in Latin so flowery it could pass as either intense prayer or passionate confession. Nuns may have taken vows of silence, but their pens were far less obedient. Letters became everything. When face-to-face meetings were too risky and meaningful glances across the cloister no longer sufficed, affection found a way through ink and wax seals. Some letters were slipped through cracks in convent walls. Others were hidden inside loaves of bread or passed along by suspiciously helpful novices with excellent poker faces. The content ranged from tender to thoroughly inappropriate. One nun wrote to her lover, a priest, that she longed to drink from the chalice of his devotion. The bishop who discovered the letter was so disturbed he ordered it burned twice, just to be safe. These secret romances weren't always fleeting affairs. Some lasted for years. One nun in France maintained correspondence with a young nobleman for over a decade, surviving 2 abbesses and at least 3 failed attempts to catch her. She was eventually exposed after quoting her lover far too accurately in the convent's prayer book. Naturally, the church viewed this literary lust with deep suspicion. When love letters were discovered, punishment followed: penance, isolation, solitary prayer. Or worse, mandatory public readings of the letters before the entire convent, which may have been more humiliating than divine judgment itself.
The lovers, if they were men of the cloth, were usually transferred to colder, less romantic postings. If they were laymen, well, one was reportedly flogged, fined, and forbidden from speaking to women altogether. His response? "May I at least continue writing?" Even more embarrassing were cases where love letters were intercepted and passed around like medieval gossip columns. Imagine spending hours crafting your deepest, most sacred emotions only to have them read aloud by a giggling novice over mead and cheese. And yet the ink kept flowing, because when walls were high and eyes everywhere, love adapted through metaphor, innuendo, and very determined handwriting. In theory, a convent was a fortress of purity. In reality, it often resembled a fortified boarding school, and in some cases, one with a surprising number of escape routes.
Medieval nuns weren't just spiritually restless, some were physically inventive. And if you're imagining delicate women tiptoeing out through rose-covered gates, think again. Some escape attempts involved climbing walls with knotted bed sheets, bribing guards, crawling through drainage tunnels, and in one memorable case, dressing as a monk and walking straight out the front door like it was any ordinary Tuesday. Motivations varied. Some fled to reunite with lovers, others simply hated monastic life. A few wanted to go home after realizing that eternal silence meant exactly that, even during meals. Perhaps the most legendary runaway was Sister Benedetta of Verona, sent to a convent at just 14 years old. She attempted to escape 3 separate times. On the 3rd attempt, she disguised herself as a novice from a neighboring abbey, forged travel papers, and escaped hidden in a vegetable cart. According to reports, she made it halfway to Venice before being caught, not because of the disguise, but because she wouldn't stop flirting with the guard. Some escapes were more dramatic. In Saxony, a group of nuns staged a collective breakout after the abbess banned music. They overpowered the gatekeeper with stale bread and vanished into the forest. Church authorities later described them as disoriented and unrepentant, which frankly sounds like the tagline for an excellent medieval drama. When captured, runaway nuns were usually dragged back and subjected to a creative combination of public shame, fasting, and confinement in a freezing stone room with nothing but a crucifix and disappointment. Repeat offenders, and there were many, were transferred to stricter convents, where food was worse and walls were higher. But even that wasn't always enough to extinguish the flame of rebellion. Some nuns escaped successfully, married their lovers, and lived out their days pretending they had never seen a cloister, much less lived in one. Because sometimes the habit just didn't fit, and sometimes the window was open.
Every scandal has its icon, and in the annals of convent impropriety, Sister Agnes of Wartzburg deserves her own stained-glass window, preferably with questionable symbolism. Agnes was, by all accounts, intelligent and charming, with a remarkable talent for music, prayer, and hosting a night in her cell for over a year. Yes, a real knight. Armor, sword, and probably several bad life choices. His name has been lost to history, which is suspicious in itself. What we do know is that he was supposedly recovering from battle wounds. Which battle remains unclear. It may have been a battlefield, a tavern, or perhaps the convent courtyard after tripping while sneaking in. According to the bishop's records, the knight was discovered after a novice reported strange metallic noises coming from Agnes's cell. When church officials investigated, they found the man hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs and humming hymns to pass the time. His only defense: Sister Agnes heals both body and soul. To her credit, Agnes didn't deny the affair. In fact, she seemed genuinely annoyed to be interrupted. She claimed she was caring for a wounded man and that compassion was a sacred virtue, which is true, though rarely invoked to justify cohabitation with one's chainmail-clad boyfriend. The scandal shook the convent, not just because of the affair, but because of its duration. A few weeks might have been forgiven. More than 12 months, during which the knight was reportedly seen at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's habit and helping with garden chores, suggested planning and commitment. The resolution was swift and theatrical. Agnes was stripped of her position, publicly shamed, and reassigned to a stricter order. The knight was fined and exiled. One record dryly notes that he did not appear particularly remorseful, which is likely the most medieval way of saying he spent the entire time smirking. As for Agnes, she later wrote letters protesting the Church's hypocrisy, citing scripture and medical texts in her defense. One line stood out: "If I had let him die, I would still be a sinner."
Not every medieval convent scandal involved sneaking knights or secret love letters. Some were louder. Moans, cries, trembling bodies, all in full view, claimed as divine contact. Enter the mystic nun. In the Middle Ages, certain nuns became famous for experiencing overwhelming religious visions. These were not quiet moments of contemplation. They were full-body encounters, eyes rolling back, bodies shaking, collapsing to the floor. Some church officials declared these episodes holy. Others had questions, especially because the descriptions sounded enthusiastic. Take Sister Beata, a nun from the Low Countries who claimed that Christ visited her every night, not metaphorically, but physically. Her writings described divine warmth, sacred embraces, and spiritual union beyond the veil of flesh. At one point, she declared herself married to the Lamb, which sounds innocent until you reach the passages where she compared his presence to a fire spreading inside and outside her body. Between us, it can be summarized in one word: desire. There was also Hadewich of Antwerp, a 13th-century mystic whose poetry reads like a medieval version of an intense romance novel, if that novel were set entirely inside a chapel. She wrote about consuming love, being pierced by divine light, and longing that dissolved the self. Some passages were so vivid that later scholars attempted to edit them into safer metaphors. The original versions survived anyway, and continue to raise eyebrows. To be fair, not every mystic was pretending. Many were sincere. Medieval theology encouraged intense emotional relationships with Christ, often expressed in language that modern readers might rate as PG-13 at best. But sincerity doesn't erase the fact that these visions caused serious reactions, spiritual and otherwise. Not everyone was impressed. Some bishops accused these women of attention-seeking. Others worried about their influence on younger, more impressionable nuns. One particularly skeptical archbishop dismissed them as hysteria disguised as holiness. He was later transferred, possibly for saying what everyone else was thinking. Still, some mystic nuns became celebrities. Their visions were recorded, copied, and venerated, which, in medieval terms, meant they successfully wrote divine fan fiction and called it theology.
If there was one thing medieval monasteries were famous for, it was controlling the body, the tongue, the desires, and especially the stomach. Fasting was considered holy. Hunger was virtue. Appetite was temptation, best left back in the garden with the serpent. But in some convents, fasting was more of a guideline than a rule, because when the bells stopped ringing and the abbess retired to her chambers, another kind of ritual sometimes began: the forbidden feast. Convents were supposed to maintain strict diets: thin porridge, bread, the occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert. Meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and wine were generally forbidden, especially during Lent or on any of the countless fasting days that made up nearly half the calendar year. But let's be honest, no one eats boiled cabbage forever without plotting, and plot they did. Some nuns created clandestine culinary networks. Friendly merchants delivered salted meats for medicinal purposes. Wine was relabeled as consecrated vinegar. Honey cakes were reserved for visitors who mysteriously never arrived. One surviving convent inventory listed 2 ducks, 1 whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese, all categorized as liturgical supplies. Draw your own conclusions. Midnight feasts became a thing. Picture a candlelit room deep inside the convent, filled with nuns laughing quietly, whispering psalms between bites of roast goose. One novice reportedly burned her hand stealing hot pastries from the oven and claimed it was punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one believed her, but the pastries apparently were excellent. Sometimes these gatherings became social events. Male visitors, merchants, priests, and in some cases men with absolutely no official reason to be inside a convent after dark joined in. One abbey in Burgundy was caught hosting unauthorized gatherings that turned out to be regular Saturday night banquets, complete with dancing, gambling, and what a bishop diplomatically described as inappropriate merriment. Not every nun participated. Many were genuinely devout and horrified by such indulgence. Others, however, interpreted fasting the way some people interpret diet food: eat quickly before someone notices. Few things made medieval church authorities more nervous than a nun with a swollen belly, except perhaps when that belly became a baby and then became a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry.
One of the most chilling scandals emerged from an 11th century French convent, where rumors began circulating about strange sounds coming from the cellar. Not rats, not faulty plumbing. As one horrified novice described it, something crying that had no right to be there. When church investigators arrived, they expected the usual discoveries: a hidden wine stash, forbidden cheese, maybe a love letter or two. What they found instead was freshly disturbed earth beneath a barrel of pickled cabbage. Under it lay the body of a newborn. The infant was wrapped in what was unmistakably a torn nun's nightcap, the standard head covering worn by the sisters. The implication was not subtle. The investigation that followed was as delicate as a plague cart. The mother was never officially named, though several nuns were quietly relocated soon after, a medieval euphemism meaning, "Please disappear before this becomes a trial." When questioned, the abbess claimed ignorance. "I was not informed of any birth," she stated, while standing next to a suspiciously well-used wash basin. She added that any woman who had given birth in the convent must have arrived already pregnant, which is one of the oldest and least effective excuses in the Scandal Handbook. This was not an isolated incident. Across Europe, hidden pregnancies sometimes ended tragically. Babies were left at monastery doors. Some were smuggled to sympathetic families. A few, heartbreakingly, didn't survive long enough for either option. The church responded with its usual cocktail of outrage and selective amnesia. Punishments ranged from public penance to discreet transfers. But as long as walls remained high and letters stayed hidden, many of these stories were buried, literally and figuratively, beneath linen and silence. If there was a scale of things nuns were absolutely not supposed to do, opening a brothel ranks somewhere between heresy and throwing a bishop out a window. And yet, in 15th century Bologna, a former nun known as Sister Clara decided she had had enough of vows, veils, and virtue. So she left the convent and opened a highly successful brothel in the former convent building itself, with the habits still in use, because subtlety apparently was not part of the business plan. To begin with, Clara was never exactly cloister material. Church records describe her as strong-willed and frequently absent from vespers. Translation: she skipped prayers and likely had plans involving wine and someone named Marco. Her departure from the convent was not dramatic. She simply left. The real drama began when people noticed that the former convent had suddenly become very popular with men who showed no known interest in theology. According to a local magistrate, Clara employed women, some former nuns, others merely creatively unemployed, and ran the establishment with military efficiency. Clients reportedly paid extra for costumes. Some requested the full confession experience, which raised theological questions no one was prepared to answer. When word reached the church,
Panic ensued. Not because prostitution was rare, it wasn't, but because this particular brothel had the audacity to look like a convent and function better than most monasteries. The optics were terrible. When summoned to explain herself, Clara simply shrugged and said, "At least here no one pretends to be chaste." She was excommunicated, then excommunicated again just to be sure. The building was seized, the operation dismantled, and Clara was reportedly sent to a convent far from Bologna. An odd choice, but perhaps poetic justice. Still, her fame lingered. The place became known locally as the Cloister of Delight. It appeared in bawdy songs and stage plays, and while the church tried to erase her memory, Clara became something of a folk legend, the nun who traded salvation for hospitality. Confession, the medieval Catholic reset button for the soul, was meant to be a solemn ritual of self-examination, humility, and repentance. You knelt, you whispered your sins, the priest offered absolution, you walked away lighter, in theory. In practice, confession sometimes created more sins than it erased. Enter the confessor scandal, a category of misconduct so common it nearly became a cliché. The setup was simple: one priest, many nuns, and a small enclosed space designed specifically for private conversations about temptation. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turns out. Some confessors took their spiritual duties seriously. Others treated the ministry of the soul as an open invitation to explore the rest of a nun's emotional and physical landscape, especially if she was young, anxious, or from a wealthy family whose influence might protect everyone involved. Boundaries were porous, curtains were thick, oversight was largely theoretical. In one infamous case, Father Anselm of Tours heard the confessions of 30 nuns and somehow developed special spiritual intimacy with 10 of them. The abbess grew suspicious when Sister Magdalene left the confessional, giggling and faintly smelling of clove wine. Reports of impropriety trickled in from across Europe. Some confessors were caught meeting nuns at odd hours. Others received love letters disguised as theological questions. One priest was discovered with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking for signs of demonic possession. Creative, at the very least. The church's response followed a familiar pattern: delicate silence, followed by reassignment. A confessor accused of misconduct was usually sent to another parish to reflect, which in medieval terms meant do it somewhere else and try not to get caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns were left in awkward positions. Some were publicly shamed, others were blamed entirely, accused of seducing the priest with feminine charm, which often translated to existing while under 30. A few refused to confess again, choosing silence over sanctity. To be fair, not every confession turned scandalous, but the structure itself, male authority, female submission, and secret conversations, was practically an invitation to abuse, especially wrapped in incense and Latin. Not all convent mischief involved flesh and desire. Some of it came through helpful nuns with access to dangerous plants. Almost every convent maintained an herb garden, an essential part of daily monastic life. Nuns prepared balms, tinctures, and herbal remedies for ailments ranging from stomach pain to demonic possession, though success with the latter was inconsistent. In some communities, these humble healers became something else entirely. They became the convent's chemists. The line between medicine and mischief began to blur. These women were known as the apothecary sisters, and they knew their plants well. Many were trained in the use of abortifacient herbs, pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, discreetly used to restore irregular cycles. The official explanation was always vague. The potion was for nerves, or for a stubborn imbalance of the humors, but everyone knew what it meant when a nun visited the herb room with a flushed face and a trembling voice. Some convents quietly gained reputations as safe places for women with delicate problems. A noblewoman with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly decide on a spiritual retreat and emerge 2 months later noticeably slimmer and far more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was particularly famous, described in records as an herbalist of great discretion. According to one extremely nervous male witness, her mixtures could calm a restless body, silence an inconvenient cough, or undo carnal sin. The Church, of course, did not officially approve, but as long as everything stayed quiet and the patients left with gratitude rather than pregnancies, few bishops asked questions. It was easier to assume the sisters were simply very good at making tea. That said, darker rumors circulated. Stories of potions slipped into wine, love charms made with hair and bone. Most were probably exaggerated, but some convents did face investigations for harboring witchcraft tendencies, and in 15th century Europe, that was not the kind of review you wanted from the local inquisitor. For most medieval nuns, public exposure was a spiritual risk. For some, it became a legal necessity, especially when private transgressions turned into public lawsuits.
Across Europe, convents were occasionally dragged into secular courts. The reasons varied: inheritance disputes, dowry claims, property conflicts, and, more awkwardly, cases involving illicit relationships, pregnancies, and behavior deemed unbecoming of a bride of Christ. That phrase appeared often. It was medieval legal code for someone has been up to something. One particularly spectacular case came from Florence. A nun named Sister Constanza sued a priest for breach of promise. She claimed he had seduced her in the confessional, promised to leave the priesthood, and, tragically, did not. She presented letters, witnesses, and a sharply pointed poem. The court was so bewildered that it postponed judgment for 3 years, apparently hoping everyone involved would either die or take vows of silence. Another case, in Cologne, involved an abbess accused of misusing convent funds to purchase luxury linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors. The visitors, it turned out, were men under 30 and unusually well built for pilgrims. The trial records read like the expense report of an upscale inn. The abbess claimed the items were for spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Sometimes the Church tried to keep matters internal. Canon law was supposed to handle wayward nuns. But when crimes spilled into the secular world, theft, abandonment of children, contract fraud, civil judges had to step in. And they were often unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything with holy indignation. In Burgundy, one nun was accused of assaulting another over a man. When questioned, she claimed she had been possessed by jealousy and possibly by the devil. A 2-for-1 defense that earned her reduced penance and relocation. These courtroom dramas were usually suppressed as quickly as possible. The Church preferred not to broadcast its internal soap operas. But news always leaked. Taverns buzzed with lines like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine account?" Or, "She took the dowry and the boyfriend to court." In a world where few people could read and even fewer could verify facts, rumor traveled faster than truth, and everyone listened.
Relics were the medieval version of a verified badge. Bones, scraps of cloth, drops of saintly blood, these objects attracted pilgrims, donations, and prestige. And many convents collected them with the enthusiasm of a modern teenager at a clearance sale. For some nuns, relics were sacred connections to heaven. For others, they were closer to a revenue stream. Take Abbess Euphemia of Turin, who claimed her convent possessed a fragment of Mary Magdalene's hairbrush. Not a splinter of the true cross, not a shred of a holy veil, a hairbrush. She described it as carrying a heavenly fragrance and encouraged visiting pilgrims to kneel before it and leave coins. When the bishop inspected it, he concluded it was almost certainly the comb of a local merchant and smelled faintly of rosemary and goat. Then there was the convent in Bruges that proudly displayed the toenail of Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothaches. Scholars later determined it was, in fact, a sliver of cow horn. The abbess insisted the miracle lay not in the relic itself, but in faith in the idea of the relic. A bold theological maneuver, to say the least. Some nuns became remarkably creative. One claimed to possess a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary, still damp with tears centuries later. Another swore she owned a thorn from the crown of thorns, despite living nowhere near any known trade routes. When asked how she acquired it, she simply smiled and said, "The Lord provides." To be fair, not all relics were fake. Some were genuinely ancient, mysterious, and possibly sacred. But the sheer volume of claims suggests enthusiasm often outpaced accuracy. Still, relics worked. Pilgrims came, coins clinked, and convents that struggled to attract visitors with sermons alone discovered that bones, real or not, made excellent marketing. Behind convent walls, not everything was rosaries and repentance. Some nuns quietly built networks of influence, all while appearing deeply concerned with embroidery. They weren't ordinary sisters, they were abbesses, often from noble families, and they understood something essential about medieval life. Power wasn't sinful if you called it administration. Take Abbess Matilda of Essen, who effectively ruled her abbey like a small duchy. She negotiated land deals, hosted royal guests, and once publicly corrected a visiting count's Latin. She was revered as both pious and terrifying, a combination that allowed her to get things done without ever technically leaving the cloister. Many convents controlled vast estates. The church frowned upon women exercising authority, but had no problem accepting their taxes. This left abbesses and senior nuns managing finances, agriculture, and disputes with tenants. And like any capable landlords, they occasionally bribed local officials, forged a document or two, and encouraged favorable tithes through timely blessings. One convent in Normandy became famous for negotiating its own treaty with a rival monastery after a fishing rights dispute escalated into something resembling a holy war. The abbess at the time, Sister Julian, wrote a peace letter scholars later described as unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. Translation: she roasted the abbot in flawless Latin. There was also political placement. Noble families often installed daughters in convents not out of piety but strategy. A nun with the right surname could act as a family agent, passing information, lobbying discreetly, or conveniently delaying papal decisions by misplacing letters. Some convents had spies. Some had lawyers. One German abbey reportedly employed a scribe who also knew swordsmanship, suggesting the document review process was particularly intense. The church noticed and occasionally tried to rein things in, but as long as the sisters appeared outwardly devout, there was little the hierarchy could do. You can't excommunicate someone for being too competent, even when they're clearly running the place like a velvet-gloved mafia.
By the late Middle Ages, some convents functioned almost like independent city-states. They had their own economies, hierarchies, rivalries, gossip networks, and yes, the occasional underground baby exchange. Not every scandal came with laughter or raised eyebrows. Some arrived quietly, wrapped in procedural silence. Not the holy kind, but the strategic kind. The kind that preserved reputations, erased crying, concealed blood, and explained away sudden illnesses. A nun who mysteriously fell sick, a cell emptied overnight, a new novice installed by morning. Because sometimes scandal wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. Consider Abbess Theodora, who ran her convent like a medieval CEO. She managed land, hosted dukes, and organized prayer vigils so elaborate they required seating charts. When 3 novices appeared pregnant in the same year, she insisted it was spiritual temptation and ordered stricter fasting for everyone except herself. When local clergy raised concerns, she accused them of envy and threatened to withhold intercession for their souls. A cold move, even by 14th century standards. Other convents leaned into notoriety.
The Abbey of St. Lucilla near Milan quietly gained a reputation as a retreat for reformed women, a vague term meaning former courtesans who now spent 20% of the day praying and 80% wearing expensive clothes. They hosted musical recitals, charged admission to holy processions, kept live peacocks in the garden. The bishop labeled them a minor concern. Rome labeled them profitable. In England, one nun became so successful at forging indulgences that her documents reached York Cathedral, where they were blessed by a bishop before anyone noticed they were written in ink mixed with berry wine. Even the devout weren't immune to strange practices. One mystic nun claimed she received visions only when fasting and dancing at the same time. Her superior eventually banned both. In response, the nun invented sacred rotation. Visitors thought she was possessed. She insisted she was simply expressing divine joy at 30 rotations per minute. Because beneath the incense in Scripture, there was always something else: life. Raw, stubborn life, pushing its way through the cracks in marble.
Imagine the scene. It's midnight in a medieval village. The fire has long gone out. 10 people sleep in a single room. Children, grandparents, servants, a goat tied near what used to be the hearth. Somewhere in the darkness, a husband slowly reaches for his wife's hand, carefully, silently. There are no walls, no sheets, no privacy, only a pile of straw and the weight of everyone breathing nearby. This was sleep in the Middle Ages, not restorative, not optimized, not measured in hours or tracked by apps. Sleep was survival. Sleep was routine. Sleep was ritual, fear, faith, and endurance woven together. People slept with animals to stay warm. They slept in groups to keep demons away. They woke in the middle of the night to pray. They feared dreams, fleas, and what might crawl out of the dark. And yet, they slept. Through bells, through storms, through war, plague, scandal, hunger, and holy contradiction. They slept through chaos the way modern people sleep through notifications, because life demanded it. And maybe there's something quietly humbling in that. We obsess over perfect sleep environments, optimal routines, and the latest trick to hack our circadian rhythms. They slept on straw, with lice, beside goats, under the belief that if they didn't wake up, it might simply be God's will. So the next time you wake up at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, convinced something is wrong with you, remember, for most of human history, that moment wasn't a failure. It was the vigil. And if nothing else, at least you're not checking on goats.